Moral absolutism is the belief that there are unchanging, universal moral truths that apply to everyone, everywhere, without exception. On the surface, it feels like a reassuring anchor in a chaotic world. People want certainty. They want rules that never bend. But history, psychology, and lived experience all reveal that moral absolutism is not a foundation of clarity. It is a trap. It creates division. It blinds people to nuance. And it often produces outcomes that contradict the very values it claims to uphold. The danger begins with how absolutism frames human behavior. By insisting there is always one right way to act, it flattens the complexity of human situations into black and white categories. Life rarely offers choices that are purely good or purely evil. We make decisions in shades of gray, where context matters, where outcomes matter, where cultural realities shape our sense of fairness. Yet, absolutism ignores these variables and demands obedience to rigid codes. When someone breaks those codes, they are not seen as mistaken or misinformed. They are seen as immoral. This shift from understanding to condemnation fuels hostility. Psychologists have observed that when people hold rigid moral beliefs, they often experience what's called moral conviction bias. They perceive their own stance as unquestionably correct and dismiss alternative perspectives as threats. A study published in Science in 2009 found that strong moral convictions reduce tolerance for compromise. People become unwilling to work with those they disagree with, even when cooperation could lead to better overall outcomes. This is why moral absolutism so easily feeds polarization. It doesn't just produce disagreement, it produces enemies. Religion has historically been the largest vehicle for absolutist thinking. Commandments, divine laws, eternal truths, these are framed as untouchable and unquestionable. The consequence has been centuries of persecution, censorship, and violence against those who thought differently. The Spanish Inquisition, witch trials, and the persecution of heretics all emerged from the belief that there was only one correct path, and deviation was not merely a mistake, but a crime against the universe. Absolutism justified cruelty in the name of righteousness, but the harm of absolutism is not confined to the past. Even today, laws inspired by religious codes dictate what people can eat, where, or whom they can love. Absolutist morality is what drives movements that oppose same-sex marriage, reproductive rights, and freedom of expression. The argument is always the same. This is wrong in all circumstances, no matter the context. The cost of this rigidity is real human suffering. Children rejected by their families, women denied autonomy over their own bodies, people imprisoned for private choices. One way to see the flaw in moral absolutism is through cultural comparison. Practices considered moral in one society may be seen as immoral in another. Eating beef is perfectly acceptable in much of the West, but in India, it is seen as deeply offensive in many communities. In some societies, arranged marriages are considered the most moral way to protect family honor, while in others, they are considered a violation of personal freedom. If morality were absolute, these contradictions would not exist. Yet they do, which shows that moral rules are not etched into the fabric of reality. They are human constructions. The anthropologist Richard Schwader argued that moral reasoning operates in three broad domains: ethics of autonomy, ethics of community, and ethics of divinity. Different cultures emphasize different domains, which explains why what feels sacred in one culture can feel irrelevant in another. Absolutism ignores this diversity and insists there is only one valid domain. This isn't just inaccurate, it erases the richness of human moral experience. Philosophers have also pointed out the dangers of absolutist thinking. Nietzsche, for instance, criticized morality that pretends to be universal, but is actually rooted in the values of a particular culture or religion. He saw it as a tool of control, a way to enforce conformity. When morality becomes absolute, it stops being about flourishing or reducing harm. It becomes about obedience. And obedience has been used by institutions for centuries to maintain power. But perhaps the most troubling aspect of moral absolutism is how it distorts empathy. When people believe they already know the one correct moral code, they stop listening to the experiences of others. If the rule says lying is always wrong, then a lie to protect someone from violence is condemned as immoral, even if it saved a life. If the rule says sexual activity outside marriage is wrong, then even consensual relationships are condemned as sinful. Empathy, context, and compassion are silenced by rigid rule following. This is why absolutist systems are often blind to injustice. Slavery, for example, was justified for centuries by appealing to supposed divine laws. Women's subordination was framed as part of the natural order. These were not seen as injustices because the absolutist framework prevented people from questioning the morality itself. Only when thinkers began to move toward moral relativism, considering context, consequences, and human well-being, did progress become possible. Modern psychology reinforces this point. Studies in moral development, such as Lawrence Kohlberg's stages of moral reasoning, show that rigid adherence to rules represents a lower stage of moral maturity. Higher levels involve recognizing universal principles like justice and human rights, but always applied with sensitivity to context. Absolutism freezes people in an earlier stage, unable to adapt their principles to real-world complexity. To make this clearer, think about medical ethics. Doctors face situations where two values conflict: preserving life and respecting autonomy. If morality were absolute, they would always have a single answer. But reality demands balancing principles, weighing outcomes, and sometimes choosing the lesser harm. A patient may refuse treatment that could save their life. An absolutist might insist life must always be preserved, but respecting autonomy often leads doctors to honor the patient's choice. This flexibility is not weakness, it is strength. It reflects respect for human dignity. One of the most revealing places to see the failures of moral absolutism is in lawmaking. Laws shaped by absolutist frameworks tend to overreach, trying to regulate every aspect of personal life, rather than focusing on reducing harm. In societies where religious moral codes dominate legislation, this has often meant criminalizing harmless behaviors. In some countries, people can be executed for blasphemy, imprisoned for expressing their sexuality, or punished for questioning dogma. These are not isolated cases. They are predictable consequences of a system that refuses to acknowledge that morality can be context-dependent. Take the example of alcohol. Some traditions ban it outright as universally immoral, while others allow it in moderation. The absolutist position that drinking is always wrong has led to prohibition laws, black markets, and organized crime, which cause more harm than the alcohol consumption itself. When moral rules ignore context, they often generate new problems that hurt more people than they protect. Absolutism also interferes with the progress of science and knowledge. The history of medicine is full of examples where absolutist prohibitions delayed life-saving practices. Autopsies were once condemned as immoral because interfering with the body was seen as a violation of divine law. For centuries, this prevented physicians from understanding human anatomy and advancing surgery. The ban wasn't based on harm reduction, but on rigid codes detached from human well-being. Only when these prohibitions were challenged did science and medicine advance. The suppression of free inquiry is another recurring consequence. When Galileo argued that the Earth revolved around the sun, he was condemned not because his evidence was poor, but because it contradicted an absolute truth held by religious authorities. Absolutism shuts down curiosity. It declares that questioning is rebellion, not exploration. The result is intellectual stagnation. What makes moral absolutism so resilient is that it disguises itself as clarity. People often fear ambiguity, so they prefer a rigid framework that tells them exactly what is right and wrong. But this clarity is an illusion. In practice, absolutism creates contradictions. Take the commandment, "Do not kill." On the surface, it seems simple. But does it apply to self-defense, to war, to the death penalty, to euthanasia? Absolute rules collapse the moment they confront reality, because life presents scenarios the rules were never designed to handle. Instead of offering clarity, absolutism produces hypocrisy. Religious texts are full of this contradiction. While prohibiting killing, they simultaneously endorse wars, executions, and massacres. This inconsistency reveals another danger. Absolutism is rarely absolute in practice. Leaders and institutions often carve out exceptions when it suits their interests. A government that bans abortion in the name of protecting life may simultaneously support wars that kill thousands. A religious group that preaches compassion may exclude entire communities from its moral concern. Absolutism, when applied selectively, becomes a weapon of control rather than a consistent ethic. In modern societies, moral absolutism also shows up in debates over technology. Consider stem cell research. For many, the potential to cure diseases like Parkinson's or diabetes is a moral imperative. But absolutist frameworks that equate embryos with fully developed persons ban this research entirely. The result is prolonged suffering for millions who might benefit from treatments. Absolutism insists on protecting a principle while ignoring the real-world harm it causes. There is also a psychological cost to individuals who live under absolutist moral systems. When people are told that even minor mistakes are grave,